Last year, I introduced you to literary theory, or literary criticism as it's also known. I told you that there's a lot to get to know. However, you need to go slowly. In this class, we will revisit those theories. Let's look again at how to apply this to Nikkei literature. The lecture will be in two parts. In part 1, we'll ask, what is literary theory? In part 2, we'll try and choose the most important literary theories to use with Nikkei diaspora literature. Let's begin by asking, what is literary criticism? First of all, what is a theory? A theory is simply an idea. It's an idea which helps us to understand the world. When we think of theory, we usually think of science and scientific theories. However, we use theory all the time. This slide explains the difference between theory and law. However, there are also similarities. Both are based on hypotheses. Both can be used to make predictions, and both can be revised. There are many examples of theories from science. You probably know most of these. From astronomy, Big Bang theory, which explains how the Earth and the universe came into being. From biology, the theory of evolution, which explains how animals, people, and so on have evolved. And of course, there are many theories in chemistry and physics. There are many theories in the social sciences and humanities too. In literature, we are most interested in literary theory. That's what we'll talk about today. Another important point is that theory does not just belong to the discipline in which it is known. For example, in economics, game theory has also been applied in different situations, such as in sociology. Here we can see how theories fit in to other knowledge, how it is different from facts, hypotheses, and laws. We can see that theories is somewhere in the middle between less absolute and more absolute. In other words, just because we have a theory doesn't mean that it works perfectly. If it worked perfectly, it would be a law. However, theory is something more than just a perspective. A perspective is just a simple way of considering something from a particular point of view. So what is literary theory? Literary theory offers us various lenses to understand literature. Think about a camera with a lens which can be changed. Here we can see everything from 18mm, 24mm, all the way up to 300mm. Depending on which lens we use, we see a totally different picture. With the 18mm lens, we can see everything, however, in not much detail. With the 300mm lens, we can see a great deal of detail, however, we cannot see the bigger picture. Literary theory is all about using different lenses to understand literature in different ways. Now, there are many different lenses we can use from literary theory. Here you can see some of them, the main ones. They're put as a timeline. The ones at the top come from as far back as 400 BC. The ones at the bottom are more recent ones, from the last 30 to 50 years. Nearly all of them are still being used, even the older ones. Why is literary theory important? Well, usually when we read a book or watch TV or watch a movie or listen to music, our understanding is quite shallow. We don't really get that deeply into it. We don't think too much about it. Literary theory allows us to get very deep in our understanding. It explains the meaning, the form, and the artistry of a text. One important point is that we all see the world differently. Therefore, even if two people use the same literary theory about the same book, their understanding and analysis should be different. Later, when you read more about literary theory, you might come across some other terms, such as literary criticism or critical theory. If you do and you get confused, come back to this slide, which will tell you the differences between them. Also, for your reference, here are the various literary theories by time period. I have shown you that there are many literary theories. However, all of them can be placed into these four circles. They can either be author-centered, reader-centered, genre-centered, or world-centered. When we want to understand literary theory, we can think of its history. It came initially from discussions between Plato and Aristotle. They tried the earliest attempts to find out what makes literature effective or ineffective. New criticism is genre-centered. It says that the key to understanding a book is within the book itself. In other words, don't think about the book's author, history, or cultural context. Just focus on the book itself. Think about how the book uses things such as imagery, paradox, irony, rhythm, rhyme. Psychoanalytical criticism is a world-centered type. It applies two main theorists, Freud and Jung. Marxist criticism is a world-centered theory. It's based on the theories of Karl Marx. It originates from sociology and politics. It basically tries to look at power and relations, in particular economic differences, class. Reader response criticism is a reader-centered type. It asks, what do you, the reader, think about the text? It's especially useful and important for famous works, works that are influential. Structuralism and semiotics are genre-centered. They basically look for patterns in language. They look for different theories: theory of modes, theory of symbols, myths, genres, and so on. Post-structuralism and deconstruction are different to structuralism because they are reader-centered. Meanings are not fixed. Feminist criticism looks at how women are treated unequally within a book. Gender criticism looks not only at women, but men too, and also at sexuality. I've talked about a lot of different theories. We've covered a lot of information. I don't expect you to know it all now. It takes many years to understand it. Usually professors only know one or two different types of literary theories well. What's important is that you have a good general understanding of how to choose a relevant literary theory, so that later, when you write your graduation thesis, you know which one to use and can go into more detail. If you would like to find out more information, here you can have some further reading. In the first part of the lecture, we looked at all the different types of literary theories. But which ones are the most useful for us in this seminar? There are two very important characteristics of Nikkei diaspora literature. One is that it is relatively modern. Most Nikkei literature is from the last 30 years. Two is that most Nikkei literature is about Nikkei culture. The three most important recent schools of literary theory are, first, language-based theories, second, gender-based theories, and third, culture-based theories. Now, since Nikkei literature is mainly about Nikkei culture, we will use culture-based theories more than the others. Of course, sometimes we might be interested in gender or language too. So why study culture-based theories? Well, the most important thing is they help us to understand culture and society better. They help us to understand other cultures better, such as those with more or less power, or those with different values, traditions, and morals. They can also help us to move towards an equal society. Now, as you discover more and more Nikkei literature, you will see that each of these three things are very important. Here are the most important types of culture-based theories: New Historicism, Cultural Studies, Post-colonial criticism, and Minority Studies. If we look again at the timeline of literary theories, we can see that most of these culture-based studies come recently. If you remember earlier, we saw that new criticism tries to only think about the book itself and not the history in which the book was created. New historicism, on the other hand, looks at the period in which a book was created, particularly the culture and the politics of that moment. It's an author-centered type of approach. It assumes that every book is the product of the historic moment that created it. So here are some of the typical questions we will ask. So imagine Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. Someone in the future might ask these types of questions. They will ask, what events occurred in Ishiguro's life that affected his outlook? Who influenced Ishiguro? What did the Ishiguro read that affected his philosophy? How powerful a writer, as a Nobel Prize-winning author, was Ishiguro? It's perhaps too early to talk about Clara and the Sun using a new historical approach, since the book was only written very recently. However, we can apply it to older works. For example, we can apply it to Ishiguro's older work, A Family Supper, which was written in the 1980s. Using new historicism, we would be interested in the period in which Ishiguro wrote it. It was during Japan's economic miracle period. It's also during the period of growing power of the United States and the relative decline of defeated Japan. Studying Nikkei culture and identity is incredibly interesting. However, it's also incredibly diverse. When we talk about identity and culture, we are talking about many different things, such as race, gender, age, class, religion, sexual orientation, language, and mental or physical ability. Cultural studies is a very recent and fantastic way to study Nikkei literature. It's world-centered. It basically uses things from different disciplines to get an understanding of a book. For example, we could use approaches from sociology, politics, history, and literature all at the same time. The key is trying to understand the ways in which culture affects and transforms everyday life, social relations, and power. Here you can see some of the typical questions we ask if we use a cultural studies approach. The third one is very important with Nikkei literature, since it considers how does the work consider the traditionally marginalized populations, such as Nikkei. The Nikkei Australians are one of the smallest groups of Nikkei in the world. Therefore, using a cultural studies approach with them can shed a lot of light about them as a marginalized population. Masako Fukui's book, When Blossoms Fall, is about a Japanese family that moves to Australia during the 1960s. Using a cultural studies approach, we can understand the tension in the novel between the competing discourses of defeated Japan on the one hand and rising Japan economically on the other hand. Post-colonial criticism is another world-centered approach. It's interested in the impact of European colonialism around the world in the 18th through to the 21st century. Now, Japan, of course, was not colonized. However, Nikkei were marginalized. So some of the same types of thinking from post-colonial criticism can be applied to Nikkei. In particular, questions 2 and 3 here are important in relation to Nikkei. Question 2 makes us think about hybridity. When a Nikkei person is living in, for example, America, they are not only Japanese, but they are American too, and they also may be something hybrid, something different from both Japanese and American. Question 3 here shows how Nikkei might be treated by the larger population. So in other words, Americans, particularly white Americans, might look at Nikkei in a certain way. As I said, Japan was not colonized. However, the United States did occupy Japan for several years after the end of the war. This has similar dynamics to post-colonialism. Therefore, we could apply post-colonial criticism to Ishiguro's A Family Supper, which is set during the post-war period. Finally, minority studies is another incredibly useful theory that can be used with Nikkei literature. Since Nikkei are minorities, this is a great way to understand how they might think. Minority studies aims to project the voices of minoritized communities within more dominant populations. In other words, it helps us to understand Nikkei within the countries in which they live. Here are some of the key questions minority studies asks. Where does the minority fit or not into society? Of course, some Nikkei fit in very well, others don't. Again, using minority studies, we can apply it to Fukui's When Blossoms Fall. This is about a Japanese family which moves to Australia during the 1960s. And in the novella, we can see various issues relating to cultural identity and belonging of the family, which can be studied very well using minority studies.